Personal stories, when done in a respectful and effective way, can be one of the most powerful tools you can do as a leader to connect with whoever you're trying to reach and connect with and build trust and inspire action.
Mark is the CEO of Storycast.
I was told you're rubbish because you can't contribute to the system in which you're supposed to operate in.
He's a speaker.
Feeling like you don't have a voice can feel extremely damaging, if I'm being honest.
He's a personal storytelling nerd, which I love.
Every single one of us has a story worth sharing, even if you think you don't.
Bestselling author of an amazing book called Glow in the Dark.
The one thing I would say is do not go to your grave with your story untold.
And the host of the Unconventionalists podcast.
So I decided to share my story, even though in my mind I'm going like, don't share your story.
Don't say it, don't say it.
Yeah, don't say it.
What is the impact that storytelling actually has on people?
And how do you turn a personal experience into a valuable personal story that resonates?
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmatched. I am very excited to have my friend Mark today on the podcast. Mark, welcome to Unmatched.
Thanks, Oana. Thanks for having me. Really, really happy to be here.
Mark is the CEO of Storycast. He's a speaker. He's a personal storytelling nerd, which I love. Best-selling author of an amazing book called Glow in the Dark, and the host of the Unconventionalists podcast. That's a kind of like a long list of things. Like, tell us a little bit about who you are and your story.
Yeah, well, I always caveat that question of like, that is probably the most dangerous question you could ask me, because we could probably fill up the whole episode and I wouldn't even realize that
That's
I'm still
true.
doing the story.
Because you're the story guy.
Well, no,
that's why you're here.
Yeah, I think on the short version is, so I was born and raised in France in the 80s in a dual heritage household. So my mum's British, my dad's French. So we spoke, weirdly, my mum made my dad speak English to us as kids, and you should hear him speak English. It is hilarious. So she was just so scared that we wouldn't speak English. So he had to speak to us in English. Anyway, so we spoke English at home and a different language outside of the house. And I kind of struggled at school. Like I just was that kind of typical annoying kid that you would have if you were a teacher, like just bouncing off the walls and super creative and could somehow like repeat the last sentence you said, even though I wasn't paying attention.
I can see that somehow. Yeah. I can visualize that.
So I have a lot of sympathy for some of my teachers, but not for all of them, because actually when I was about 6 or 7 and then about 9, I think I was heavily bullied by not my peers, but like my school teachers. And they used to put my spelling test out in front of everybody to kind of say, look, this isn't a spelling test, it's a cemetery. And I always used to dread that aspect of like saying, and it turns out it's because I'm dyslexic. We didn't really know it back then. And so I struggled to read out loud. I struggled to spell. I struggled to do basic maths. And that doesn't do well in a very archaic kind of structured educational system like France, right? And just to give you some context, like I hated school so much that not only did I regularly, and I'm sorry, Mum, if you're listening to this, but not only did I regularly like pretend to be ill so I didn't have to go to school. And any child listening to this or any parent listening to this with their kids, you should probably pause at this moment and put some headphones in, because I'm about to relieve some sort of tactics. But I used to put my thermometer on the radiator and just stop it before it got to like ridiculous like temperatures. And then I'd like, my mum like, I'm not feeling well. It's like, it's like 39.5. She's like, oh, you're going to stay home. And she'd go to work and I'd stay home and play video games. And I did that a lot, but it got so bad at one point. I faked having appendicitis because I heard that if you had appendicitis, you'd go to hospital for like a week or 10 days. Like, I'm not making this up. This is a true story.
But you didn't know that you'd also get a surgery.
Yeah, right. So I get there and he's just, and so he's like, literally the doctor's putting his hands around my stomach and he's like, is this hurting? And I don't know. I'm just like, oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. Right, well, it's probably like appendicitis. We'll get him in the operational block tomorrow. And I was like, oh, wait, what? So, and I was like, but that doesn't mean I'm out for like 10 days. It's like, yeah, cut a piece of my organs out. I don't care. So the reason why I say this is I really felt like I didn't belong. I really felt like I didn't have any sense of purpose or any contribution whatsoever, because that's kind of what I was told. I was told you're rubbish because you can't contribute to the system in which you're supposed to operate in. But then my mum was a school teacher and she used to put on plays for kids because she really wanted kids to experience like the thespian arts and the incredible experience of getting on stage and getting out of your comfort zone and all that stuff. And when we were kids, my brother and I, she had to do something with us. Like she couldn't just leave us in the car. So she used to like drag us along her rehearsals. And I was 4 or 5, whatever it was. And I would be like a bush or like a tree in the background. And like, and I just loved it. And when I was around 6, maybe something like that, I got on stage in this sold out kind of theater where she was putting up the school play with all the parents. And I was the puppet of ventriloquist. Like I didn't even have any words. And I get brought out and everybody's like in stitches and I'm kind of doing like this performance. And at the end, like all these adults come to me and say like, oh my God, that was amazing. I thought you were a real puppet. And I got, for the first time, I got praises um, for like being me, and it was nonverbal. And I realized then that it's like sometimes we can be in the wrong environment, and it doesn't mean that we don't have anything to provide or share. But feeling like you don't have a voice can feel extremely frustrating, hurtful, and damaging. If I'm being honest, and so I always had this, and the reason why I mention all this is that the one thing I did do, even though I really struggled at school because I was held back a year and then eventually kicked out of conventional education, but it's a happy ending, people. I ended up getting published by,
We need to get to that happy ending
yeah,
quite soon.
yeah. But
We're wondering.
but it's kind of like I used to be fascinated by stories because stories used to take me away to another world. Like I would escape my reality. I could go into these other worlds and I would feel these incredible emotions. Like the first time I went to the cinema, I was 5 or 4 years old with my dad taking me to a really inappropriate movie for my age where this like bear gets killed basically on TV and I'm screaming my head off. But I loved this idea of stories and I realized that I was navigating the world and adapting to the world by making up stories, crafting stories. So like I didn't understand conventional educational, methods, but I would use stories to kind of understand the lesson. And so I've just been obsessed with that ever since. Um, and I guess if you look back throughout my career, where I was for 10 years employed primarily as a sales kind of marketing, fundraising kind of roles, like I always use stories as a tool. And yeah, that's a long-winded answer to your question. I told you, Oana, this is a slippery slope you're going down.
I love it. But that's why we're here to talk about stories. And honestly, I love that because stories are what fuels us as humans, right? I mean, this is how we connect since forever. And that's basic human understanding, in psychology. We connect through storytelling. And I think it's a little bit underrated these days because we live in this high performance driven society where everything needs to be functional. And then I think we're losing a little bit the meaning of things, versus maybe like 50, 60, 100 years ago, where there was a lot more meaning to people and, like to societies. Now it's all very performance driven in a way, the way I see it. So it's great that we have opportunities to talk about storytelling and we have more and more people coming up to talk about that. So I'm very excited. How did you find that space in the world? Because you were always saying that you couldn't really find your space, you couldn't really find your purpose. What led you to maybe find it and create Storycast?
So, I mean, I think I want to say a caveat. People listening to this or watching this, like it's really easy to look back and connect the dots, but it doesn't feel linear when you're going through the process,
Of
if
course
that makes
not. Yeah.
sense. So again, as a kid, I've got these memories of sitting around the table of my grandparents, my French grandparents, especially my grandmother, who would tell these stories of her father, who was like a war hero during the Second World War and who won like one of the highest rankings you can get as a civilian from Charles de Gaulle. Um, and and I just was fascinated by like these stories, right? And then slowly but surely, I started to realize as we're navigating this world that everything is around stories, is about stories. The way that we show up in the world, the way that we dress, the way that we communicate, the way that we interpret the world, what we think the world thinks about us, what we think about the world, all of these are stories. And you can either have an empowering story or you can have a disempowering story. And the story that will change your life isn't actually a story you'll hear, it's the story that you share and it's the story that you tell yourself. So I kind of understood that pretty quickly. And then, throughout my life, I had these different kind of experiences. So when I was at university, I had a radio show. And I don't know if I've said this before in a podcast, so I'm just going to say this out loud and get it over with. But my DJ, it was on UKCI, it was the radio station. And my show was called Session Up with DJ Casper, your friendly DJ host. And
Cool.
that
I
was,
mean, it's
yeah,
not that
it's not that
bad.
bad, right? But I mean,
No.
that was my gig. And but I used to bring my friends who like were MCs or played guitar or DJs, and I would get them on and I would show their art, and then I would talk about the stories because I really want people to connect with them not just with what they did, but it also gave meaning and context to the work they did. And I really loved that. And then my first career out of university was effectively like a commercial journalist, a glorified title for like basically sales, a sales guy. But I would go around the world, and our role was to try and change the perception on emerging economies in global media such as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and do these investment reports, that the special ads that you see on the top of, they call advertorials for those who are familiar with that space. But we used to do these that kind of investment guides, and I would go in there and we would interview heads of states and CEOs and chairmen of like Fortune 500 companies and so forth. And we were supposed to sell the ads. That's why we were there. But I didn't care about that. What I loved is hearing their stories. Like we would create this emotional bond around, like I would ask them, like, so, what keeps you up at night? Like, why are you proud of being like a South African or whatever country we're in? And I just loved hearing the backstories of what people, what made people who they are. And fast forward, I eventually do a video CV because in 2011, no one was doing video CVs, and I knew I needed to stand out. And because of my brain works, I didn't want to do a conventional CV. So I did a video CV and it went viral. I think you can still look it up. The website was something like adreamjobwouldbenice.com, or if you type in my name, video CV, it'll come up. It's got like over 1 million views. But that landed me a job at the country as a country manager at the Movember Foundation. For those who are not familiar with the Movember Foundation, it's an amazing charity that has been operating since 2003, I believe, and they are one of the leading men's health charities in the world, specifically targeting prostate cancer, testicular cancer, men's mental health, and physical inactivity. And I joined them as employee number 3 of Team Europe with the task of effectively launching the foundation across some European countries and growing it in some of the existing markets. And all I had was like a questionable mustache, a backpack, and a story. That was it. And I had the company story, the charity story, and I had my personal story where I felt compelled to join. And for those of you who've maybe read my book or are going to read my book, you'll hear the stories. I think it's one of the first chapters. But in 2009, I went through a bit of a tough time. And looking back at it now, I was probably going through situational depression, but I didn't have the words. And I'm struggling to get up. I'm struggling to do anything. And I tell my mum, and I'm like, I think might be depressed. And she looks at me and she goes like, don't tell anyone, not even Dennis.
Typical.
Yeah. And I'm like, and Dennis, by the way, is my best friend who I've known since we're born. So I go, but why not? And she goes, because no one's ever going to give you a job again. And so, we've spoken about this since. And of course, how, she was trying to protect me and she didn't know better and all this stuff. But I think I kind of anchored that there's like, there are safe stories and there are unsafe stories to share. And there are parts of ourselves that we shouldn't be bringing to work because it creates a risk for a viability to survive. And so when I was launching November France, I'm sitting at this bar launching at this event, very small event, few journalists, few potential people want to fundraise. I'm giving a presentation. I talk about like the foundation. At the end, I do a Q&A and, a few questions like, oh, can I grow a mustache even if I can't really grow a mustache? Or, like what happens? Typical stuff. And a journalist raises a hand and she goes, I'm just curious, like, why did you want to launch the foundation? Like, why did you quit this job in this perfectly great business school to go and work in this really hairy charity? And in that moment, I had a crossroad. It was like one of those crossroad moments, one that you might have had, where I could give the vanilla statement of like, I think it's a great charity, a great track record. I think they're doing great work. I think the partnership we're looking to do in France is going to be really impactful. Or I could say the truth, which is when I was going through a really tough time and I felt very alone, when I came across the foundation, for the first time, I felt seen and understood because I saw people who I resonated with, who spoke a similar language, who used humor and who were talking about deep stuff. And I really connected with it. And I wanted to be able to be part of that movement. And so I decided to share my story, even though in my mind, I'm thinking, my mom going like, don't share your story.
Don't say it.
Don't say it. Yeah, don't say it. And so what was weird is I thought the world was going to open up beneath me and swallow me, I thought people were going to start like booing me and just like, how could you take this guy seriously? Instead, not only did nothing happen really, but a guy came up to me at the end called Matt and he said, look, I just want to say thank you for sharing a bit about your story because I actually haven't heard a guy talk about it openly. And I've been going through something similar and I came here just to get a bit of information, but now I really want to take part and I'll get some of my teammates colleagues to do it. Well, lo and behold, over the course of the 4 years, my team and I managed to raise 2.8 million euros for Men's Health. We got 110,000
Wow.
people to sign up, and won multiple awards along the way. But I really believe that one of the key to the success that we had was in part my ability to enroll and engage people when I communicated and spoke with them. And I always came from a place of passion. I always came from a place of, sort of um, like almost contagious passion. But I shared my story. I was willing to be vulnerable, open, for the sake of connection and serving.
We're getting back to the episode in a minute, but first I wanted to share a new product update that my friends at SEMrush are launching right now. It's called Daily Traffic Data, and it's part of their Trends Competitive Intelligence solution. Now, as you might know, I'm transitioning from my corporate role into becoming a business owner, and let me tell you, knowing where your competitors are is pretty damn important, especially when crafting the best offer for your audience. So when SEMrush reached out and asked me to test this new tool, I immediately jumped on the opportunity because why not be ahead of the game on this one? So, if you're serious about growing your brand and your business, you have to know what's happening in your industry on a daily basis. But let me clarify, having an unmatched approach to brand building does not mean you stay in a vacuum. Instead, you use the available data in your favor to maximize your marketing investment. And most importantly, understanding the trends and shifts early can seriously save you and your team lots of headaches in the long run. Okay, so here are some of the coolest features that will, in my opinion, optimize your marketing efforts. First, you can analyze any market daily and you can identify emerging trends. You can also conduct audience research and compare audience overlaps, which is so important. Then you can automate competitive tracking while uncovering daily competitor traffic stats. And probably my favorite one is the benchmark against the competition on a day by day basis, which I think is so crucial. Growth doesn't come easy these days, but check out SEMrush trends and you see the difference it can make for your business. And trust me, you won't look back. You can have, perfectly good managers, people that can operate in a certain environment and probably do the job well. Or you can have good leaders that, empower, that motivate, that inspire, and that are able to attract more of the like minded people to join a cause. As Simon Sinek says, you want to work with the people that believe what you believe, not that you don't want to work with the people that just come in for the paycheck. You want to work with the people that believe what you believe, and I strongly believe that as well. And so I want to hear from you as well a little bit, this perception from your point of view of what is the impact that storytelling actually has on people. What happens to our brains? What happens when we get that, personal story that you share, to that journalist at that point in time? What
So
happens? What's the magic,
yes, okay. So there's a couple of things that come up. The first one is, let's talk about the biology just real quick. So Hugh Harrison did a study at Princeton where he studied brains, as part of a study to understand how do our brains connect to stories. And what he found is that if you look at sort of some of the research, is that our brains, when one person starts sharing a story and when one person's listening, our brain activity is sort of out of sync. And as you progress through the story, our brain activities kind of sync up. And effectively, what they found is that we can tap into the emotions and literally make people feel the same thing that we're feeling as we're sharing an experience, like an experience. It's often why we get moved. For example, when someone shares like a really heavy or emotional story, or even when someone kind of goes to like shares about overcoming adversity and managing to overcome the odds. And like effectively there's amygdala in our brain. It's an almond shaped nuclei that controls some of our behavior and actions and feelings, and stories that activates the amygdala. So just from a biological perspective, we are literally hardwired to resonate with, connect with, and remember stories more than anything else. In fact, if you look at, anthropologists say that when we discovered fire, we started lengthening our days into the night, and our labyrinth lengthened because we started cooking meat. And primarily what we talked about were stories, and stories not of like, hey, Steve like tripped on the other day, but more, this is how you catch a mammoth, or this is how you run away from like a predator. These are the berries you should definitely not be eating, or this is where I found some
Tips
shelter.
and tricks.
Tips and tricks to survive, right, as a species. And
Yeah.
so we were really hardwired to listen. And I would actually argue that some of the best probably leaders and tribe leaders back then were really great storytellers because they were able to pass on that knowledge. So if you take that from one side, like we are biologically predispositioned to kind of respond better to stories. The other thing that happens is that I think when we are in the presence of someone sharing their personal story in an authentic way, and I always say it's context dependent and it has to be serving those, because I always say the difference between a self-serving story and a serving story is the intention. So it's kind of like if I'm sharing a story because I just want you to feel sorry for me, or I'm just looking for praises, or I'm just looking for validation, that's not a story that's meant to serve, right? It's more kind of like, hey, I need your attention. And those kind of stories are best kept for like therapy. But if you're thinking about, hey, I just want to share the story so I can share this lesson that I learned so that you don't have to go through this pain, or that you can save time, or that you can feel less alone, then 100% that story makes sense, right? I just want to caveat that because that's an often
Mm.
misconception that people have when I work with around like, oh, but is this going to be like one big therapy session? Um, so the other thing is that it suddenly changes our perception of others. So especially in the workplace, right? Let me give you an example. When I used to work at Movember, there was this guy called Pablo. He was a finance director, really lovely guy, kind of more of a quiet introvert type, I would say, than the rest of some of us that were a bit more kind of loud. And look, I didn't have particularly like I was friends with Pablo, but we weren't particularly like tight or had a deep connection. But we ended up together on a Belgium trip for a fundraising event, and on the way back, we couldn't find a taxi. We had a few drinks, so we walked all the way from the venue back to a hotel, and we got to talk. And I've always been wildly curious about people's stories. I've just always like, tell me about you. Like, I'd much rather say, tell me something about you than what do you do, right? Like, always when I can ask when I can have that opportunity to ask someone a question. And he starts telling me the story of like how he basically came at a crossroad where I think him and his wife had to make a decision about who was going to pursue a PhD or a career. And he was like, look, I'll support you, and you go and do that. And so he kind of put himself a little bit back so she could go and do what she wanted. So at first I was just like, wow, that's like a really compassionate, courageous thing to do. But also then he said, like, I've been working on a novel for 3 years. And he started telling me about this novel that he was working on. I was like, well, he's not just a numbers guy. He's a human being with dreams and aspirations. And my connection to Pablo completely shifted. It completely changed. And it's not just with our peers or our leaders. It can be with our customers too, like our clients. Like I work with this particular client. I won't name her, but she came to me. She wanted me to help her, like put herself out there more, be more authentic when she communicates, be able to connect with her audience, build trust, inspire action, all that stuff. And so I was a bit resistant. I'm not going to lie. I had some kind of red flags, alarm bells that were telling me, like, I think she says she wants to be authentic, but I don't think she's ready to be authentic. I think she thinks she's like there, but I don't think, so it's all this kind of stuff. But I take her on board. You never know. Very quickly, I'm like, oh, I'm dragging my feet in every session and I'm having a conversation with her. Like, I'm just like, it's soul, like, it's just energy draining. Like, I feel like she's not trusting the process, that she's very resistant, that she lacks a lot of self awareness. And I'm actually considering firing her at some point. I'm just like, look, this is just not, worth the time, energy, and money in any kind of way. And I get to the story part of the program. It's like, let's talk about your story. And Oana, let me tell you, when I heard her story, everything changed. Everything changed. Just like to hear how much adversity she had to overcome, from the background in which she grew up in, to having to sort of go through a very difficult divorce where when she had a whole community turn her back on her because nobody divorces from arranged marriages in her community, and really being like this beacon of hope for her kids because she wanted to create this new destiny for her kids. And when she shared a story, I softened, she softened. Some kind of almost like sacred bond happened, right? And it changed everything. And I think after that,
Yeah.
so the point is that personal stories, when done in a respectful and effective way, can be one of the most powerful tools you can do as a leader, as a business owner, to connect with whoever you're trying to reach and connect with, right? And build
Mm.
trust and inspire action.
Yeah, and also because I think that it's not so uncommon that we tend to, especially in our society these days, we tend to mask a lot about who we really are, because sometimes who we really are is not necessarily, you know, I don't know, the status quo, the most accepted thing wherever you are. And I can remember when I moved to Spain in 2001, I was 19, freshly moved from Romania, right? I never have lived anywhere else but Romania, an ex-communist country. And I moved all over to Madrid, to Spain, where nobody spoke English, where the culture of the time was so conservative. And I remember how challenging it was to kind of like try to fit in, right? Because A, I was Romanian, bad reputation. B, my Spanish wasn't great when I joined, you know. So I remember vividly how I would try to mask everything that I was and who I was and where I was coming from. And I remember specifically an example of, I was trying to rent an apartment. I was calling, and initially I was saying, my name is Oana, I'm from Romania, and I'm trying to, rent this apartment. They would hang up, literally. And then I changed the story. And then I started to say, my name is Anna, which is a much more recognizable, you know, a name. I study at an American university, and which was true. And I'm looking to rent an apartment. It worked every time. And then when I met face to face with the people, everything was fine. And I would say, okay, well, actually, no, you misunderstood. It's Oana. I'm actually from Romania. Yes, I'm studying at an American university. Everything was fine when they met me. But I had to break that barrier. And, you don't think, because those are tactics for you to kind of like pull through and survive. But these micro things that you do on a daily basis to change who you are to fit a mold that you're supposed to kind of fit in, because otherwise you're, what are you going to do, affects you so much. And then it's so interesting what you're saying, that when you actually break through that shell, because you build a shell throughout the years, and then at some point that shell needs to break. I think that's where the magic
So
happens.
first of all, I'm sorry they had to go through that. I think any time where we have to, that way we feel like we have to band ourselves in order to fit in, is not really fitting in. You know what I mean? But sometimes you just do it because you have to, because you had to, right? And I remember talking about with my friend Vanessa Bello, the founder of High 15. We're talking about this. She features in my book. We're talking about this concept of storytelling, and she was like, "Look, you're a white, cisgender, straight male, so you're coming at it from this perspective, right? Like you're talking about like the importance you need to share a story. Some marginalized communities don't even feel like they can even just show up like because of how they look. Forget about their story. It's just like, you're not going to accept me because of how I look. And like, that's like a layer to go even deeper to go into the story. So I want to acknowledge that, because I also understand that I may not be aware of some of the various experiences that people listening and watching this may be going through. What I will say is one thing recently that I've kind of had a bit of an aha moment, and it was thanks to a brilliant conversation that Amanda Baker from Five Stories shared with me on a podcast called 10% with the author of the new book Double Ganger, Naomi, I just forgot her surname. But she did this whole book around this concept of our sort of avatar, our digital avatar versions of ourselves online, and how we sort of polish and create them in order to feel a sense of control of this identity we have. And I was just listening to this, something struck, like I was just like, oh, if we, and throughout life we've done this, right? Because we are social creatures who need to feel secure in our connection with our parent guardian in order to survive. So we will often sort of tone down, hide, play small in order to be able to fit in and survive, right? It's also part of a survival mechanism. But these micro kind of abandonments of selves throughout life sort of add up, and eventually you kind of almost forget who you are at your core, and you're juggling all these different identities. The identity that you're maybe with your partner, with your kids, with your friends, with your colleagues, and so you've got these different identities, right? And stick with me, because I think I've got a point to make. What I realized was like, Oh, I specifically work with business leaders and CEO and founders and organizations. That's kind of like my crowd. And when I go in and I'm effectively asking, like, hey, like, who here wants to be a bit more vulnerable and a bit more authentic for the sake of connection, for the sake of alignment, for the sake of feeling a sense of belonging, right? Within yourself and with others. What I realize that what I'm actually asking you to do is risking this identity that you've neatly and tightly created, where your livelihood is attached to it, whether that's your income, whether that's your love and connection, whatever that is, there is a risk. And what happens in people's minds is that they often believe that the risk outweighs the benefits. And therefore, as long as that happens, we stay hiding behind a mask, behind our stories, because we're afraid that if we show up a little bit more as ourselves, then we won't be accepted. We'll be rejected. And if that happens, then our deepest fear rises up. We're not enough, we're not lovable, and we're going to die alone, effectively.
Yeah. And I would add one more thing to that, which is we give up ownership over ourselves, and we give up control over our own narrative. I don't want to say way too easily, because I do believe, in my experience as well, it's based on the need to survive. It's a survival mechanism. So it's not like you're doing, oh, just because I want to do it. It's because on a daily basis you have to do it. You have no choice, but you give away a lot of that control. And so I think that, in this personal development evolution that we go through as humans, at some point I think there is this, I call it the critical moment of truth, where something happens in your life, something where you're kind of forced to take back control. And by taking back that control, you set up different, layers of protection, which are not just this outer shell, which is a fictitious thing that you create just to mask who you really are. But you put through, I think, just different layers of I don't know, things that you can do in the world that doesn't make you feel like such a huge risk of being yourself. You know what I mean? That might be, oh, I cannot be myself because I'm going to lose my job, or I cannot be myself because I'm going to lose this relationship. It means that you're putting all of your energy into just one thing, where people are so complex and we have so many layers, where we need to kind of like put all that energy into different things and spread ourselves a little bit more, across different things. So I think that's also for me, the learning is that to take back control, you need to not depend on one single thing that kind of puts the label on you,
And
on who you
and look,
are.
and it takes time. And like interest your story when you shared your story remind me somehow of a guest I had on my show called Jivan McCormick, the former president of Scribe, and he wrote a book, which is like a pretty incredible book. But the one about his story, I think it's called the American. I forgot what it's called, but it's like the American Dream, like how he made it or something. Um, he is someone who speaks about this and has spoken about this, but he was in a sales job and he just couldn't get meetings, like with a name like Jivan, right? Like he just couldn't get callbacks, he couldn't get appointments booked, and suddenly he just changed his name to JT McCormick. Suddenly, he was getting bookings. He started rising through the corporate America. And when he became the CEO, he was like, there are a bunch of kids out there and people who look like me and who've got names like me who I'm doing a disservice by hiding behind JT McCormick. So he re-owned his name, like Jivan McCormick, and kind of. So, it for sure, I think, I love that idea of that critical moment of truth. It actually reminds me of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey sort of principles, if you think about the call to adventure. One of the first steps in Joseph Campbell, for those who are not aware, he's the author of The Hero of a Thousand Faces. He's often credited for some of the best kind of stories in the world, from Star Wars to Harry Potter to all those kind of things. And he studied mythology and storytelling across different cultures and religion. And he found that there was one common theme across all of them. He called it the monomyth, and he boiled it down to these 12 different principles that every single story across every religion, across every myth has. And one of the first principles is we have a call to adventure, and we either have an opportunity to refuse that call or to accept that call. It might have come in through in your life through a heartbreak, a tragic accident, a divorce, a disease. You got fired, like fill in the blank, right? But actually, I think the critical moment of truth can also be there's a moment where you have an opportunity to rise up, shatter the kind of mask, and almost come out naked, or double down and keep on the control. The first that comes up to me, I don't want to think about this, is Lance Armstrong, the cyclist, when the whole affair broke out of his the doping affair, but also the way he treated people around him, multiple sort of testimonies of his former teammates kind of coming out and saying just how much of a bully he was and just how like controlling he was. And he goes on Oprah, right? And that was a moment I think he could have grabbed the critical moment of truth, and he didn't. That's the honest truth. He just
Yeah.
didn't.
Owning the truth. Yeah.
Yes, he didn't. Like he didn't go like, you know what, I messed up, hands down, just messed up. I wasn't a nice person to be around.
Mm.
I wanted to win at all cost, whatever that cost was. It doesn't mean that I didn't overcome a huge amount of ordeal of pain, and what I did wasn't extraordinary, but I apologize for my behavior. What I did was, it wasn't like a full ownership. And I think we all go through these moments, and we have multiple layers. Even I today, look, I don't want to stand here as a hypocrite. There are still parts of myself that I really struggle to let other people see because of the fear of how I'll be perceived. Will you still love me? Will you still want to work with me? Will you, like, all these questions that we all go through various degrees? And yeah, I've shed a lot of layers over the years of doing this work. And I've seen a lot of people shed layers over the years. And I just think that it might be a lifelong journey, right? But the one thing I want to say is do not go to your grave with your story untold.
I want to step a little bit into your work at Storycast, and how you work with leaders there to enable them to tell their stories. The way I look at this, what you just explained, is we have our core identity, and that's everything that we are. And we know ourselves very well because we've been living within ourselves forever, right? Since we were born. So there's nobody better to know the ins and outs than ourselves. Now, someone from the outside, I mean, they don't have so much time available on their hands to like understand all the deep, sides of me. Like you wouldn't have time, or you wouldn't have interest to like spend, hours
Let
and
me
hours and
share with
hours
you
and
my
hours to.
biography. Sit down, and I'm going to give you 14 hours of
Yeah,
biography. Yeah.
exactly. That doesn't work, right? So what do we do? That's where, whatever we call it, personal branding or brand, that's how I see it, brands. It's a bit of the curation, of that story. I think that that's where you need to be self-aware to know which parts you want to share, that you feel comfortable in a way that people, and I think this is the main objective. The objective is for people to perceive you in the right way, in the way that you think you are and you want the world to see you as well,
I have,
because
yes.
I,
Sorry. No,
yeah,
no. I was going to say, I've got,
no, tell me your opinion on
so
that.
I have a slightly point of view on that last point, but I'm going to go back to the first one. So one of the first things I do, right, with leaders I work with, and I've got, for example, I'm in conversation with a really cool company at the moment, and they want to bring me in to work with some of their leaders that they want to kind of invest in. And this idea is kind of like, how do we help them reflect back on their journey and identify and acknowledge parts of their journey that are relevant to the work that they do, and to enable them to better connect with their teams, with their stakeholders, customers, etc. One of the biggest problems I see, and you and I clearly, I mean, the work that you do, obviously you love story. Like, there's no way you'd be doing what you're doing if you didn't believe in storytelling. Just like, let's just be honest, right? Um, but I'd say the vast majority of people fall within three different categories as to why they're not sharing their story, and I'll break them down really quickly. The number one is they don't see how their story is valuable to anybody else. They don't see how their story is relevant to the work that they do. They think that their story is dull, boring, and not that exciting, and they don't have a Hollywood kind of story. So what's the point? So that's number one. to that is kind of what I talk about in the book. It's what I talk about when I give keynotes and run sessions. It's like you're actually, and it's interesting because you said, we are the ones who know ourselves best. Because of that, we are the worst judges of our story's ability to impact others, period. Because what we're suffering from is proximity bias. The idea that you're so close to something that you no longer see the value of it, right? Like you're standing on this mountain in the valley in your story and you just don't see it. And so I often use this metaphor. I say, look, like, Oana, can I use it just for a second? As an
Yeah,
example? Yeah.
sure.
So can you think about what
Go
is
ahead.
one of your favorite films?
Shawshank Redemption. That was easy.
Great film. Okay.
It's a good
So
movie.
do you remember the first time you saw it? Like how it made you feel? Like what is it about that film that just resonated with you?
I have to say I haven't seen it in a long time, so I don't know. I don't remember all the details, but I think it was just the depth of the story. The depth of the story, the so many layers, the silver lining at the end.
Yes. Yes.
You know,
Love it.
the I get chills when I think
Yeah.
about it because it's you follow those people through that journey, and then when it's out, when they're out, and you see how it all ends, it's like, wow, it's such a full circle moment. That's where I meant at the beginning when I was saying things used to have way more meaning in the past. Movies like this one had so much meaning, whereas like now it's all like repetition of repetition, is like part 2, part 3, part
Yeah. There's still
4
some
of
gems. There's
something.
still some gems.
There's
There's
still
still
some
some gems.
gems, but
But I hear you.
they're
Like yeah.
rare.
It feels like
Yeah.
both you and I like stuck in the nostalgia of like those were the good times, like
Yeah.
good movies. But
All the past times are better.
right. But so here's the thing. Like how many times would you say you've seen that film in your whole life? Like how many times would you say you've seen the film?
Maybe 3 or 4
Maybe 3 or 4
times,
times.
I'd
Cool.
say.
Now imagine if I locked you in a room, I gave you some snacks, and there was access to a bathroom nearby. Don't worry. And I made you watch that film not once, not twice, not 3, not 10, 100, let's say 1,000 times back to back. You had to watch that film. How many times would it take you to see that film before you want to like shoot yourself?
I mean, honestly, it takes not a lot for me to get to that point because I get bored quite
So
quickly.
once, twice,
Even if I
3. I mean that by that.
probably,
So
if I have to do it one after the
yeah.
other, it's probably like
Well,
by the second time I'll
here's
be like, okay, I got it. I got
here's the punchline.
it.
It's the same thing with your story. You're so used to your story that it's become so boring and dull and like, oh my God, do I really have to talk to myself? Whereas somebody else might be the first time they see Shawshank Redemption and they're going to feel all those feels. And it's the same thing with your story. The first time that you share your story, someone out there is going to go, hey, I resonate with that. I can identify with that. Or thank you for shining a light on something that I thought I was alone in dealing with. So that's number one. Number two is the imposter syndrome that comes in. It's kind of like, who am I to even share my story? So you're making it about you. And that's why I always say about like, actually, it's not about you. Your story is about you, but it's not for you, right? It's actually for people that you're trying to serve and reach out to. Because I always say that like your story has the ability to change someone's life who needs to hear it as to not feel alone and get a new sense of hope about the future. So never underestimate that power. And the third one is fear. It says like, actually, I'm not comfortable with sharing my story because it involves, I mean, all of us have been through some crappy stuff. Let's just be honest, right? Like if you made it this far in life, you've been through some pretty crappy stuff. Either something's stuff that people have done to you, stuff that you've done to people, or stuff that people did to those you love. Like it's going to have happen, right? So a lot of us have shame, guilt, and remorse, all those kind of feelings tied around our stories. And so, nobody wants to be known for the shame, right? Like Emily Gindelsberger made me realize that. And I was just like, oh yeah, 100%. So the fear is around like, okay, how can we make sure that you share your story in a way that feels safe and that is serving others? And I think it's like to wrap up this point is like, I don't think for me it's about I'm sharing a story so that I come across a certain way. I actually would argue I'm sharing the story so that I can serve you in some way. And I might not look great in the process. And actually I'm okay with that. It's almost like I have to fear rejection and disconnection for the sake of connection. Does that make sense? It's kind of like the actual thing you're most afraid of is the opposite, is what you'll get. Like I can tell you over and over and over again, clients that have had come back to me saying, I was holding on to the story for 30 years. I was terrified of what the world would think about. Turns out, every time I share the story, people deeply resonate with it. People lining up to come and speak to me after I get off stage. People reach out to me after they hear me on a podcast. Like, it's just amazing. It's like this ripple effect. And obviously, some people will not like hearing your story, and some you, but there's an expression for us that says, if you want to make an omelet, you got to be willing to break eggs.
I love that. That sounds very French. And I agree. I think the point is more that not that you're perceived in a weird way, or that you're creating yet another mask, right, for people to see, but more like
A
to
true
kind of like
expression.
curate, yeah,
Yeah.
to curate that part of you that you want people to actually see. I mean,
Yes.
there's still things
Yes.
inside that I don't want to share necessarily. There are things that belong to me and that they will always belong to me, and there's other things that I do believe that serve others, as you say, and I totally agree with that. And it's not an ego driven thing either, because that's also, I think, a bit the misconception, is that when you start to be visible, it's like, oh, look at that person being on stage and wanting to get all the limelight. It's like, well, yes, there's some people that do that, but there's also some people that actually have something to share like you do, and that's very useful to other people, that can use that knowledge in some kind of way. So that's what I meant with curating
Yes.
the
I love that.
information in a
Yeah,
way
yeah,
that
yeah.
is digestible for people,
Yes, and you
so that
have
they
to.
understand.
You have to. Like,
Yeah.
that's the thing. So one of the methodologies that I teach and I talk about is, how do you turn a personal experience into a valuable personal story that resonates and people remember and are moved by in some way. And so yeah, there are tools that you can use. There are definitely steps that you can take, because otherwise you're just babbling on and you're just doing a monologue and you're boring. And if anybody can take anything from what I say, if you share a story in a professional or a business context, you better make sure you have a point as to why you're sharing that story. That you're not just going like, and yep, that's when it all went to crap. Any questions? And it's like,
No,
yeah,
nothing.
yeah.
So if there would be like one main tip that you could give me to really access that story and be able to share the golden nugget, you know, what would that
I
tip
mean,
be?
I'll give you the whole thing. My mission is to try and help people unleash the power of their story so they can truly see how it transforms not just the world, but actually also transforms themselves, right? Their relationship to self. So I'm not hoarding on any information that I can, thanks to your platform and thanks to your voice, share with anybody listening. So I talk about this in the book. It's 3 steps, very easy. It's source, shape, and share, right? Like, those are the 3 steps that you go through: source, shape, and share. Step number 1 is source. You source your story. So you effectively go through the river of life exercise. If you buy my book, there's like, you can access some sort of bonus material, download the PDF, all this stuff, but you could just do it now anyway. You map out your entire life from birth to date, professional and personal, highlights and lows, the good, the bad, the ugly, the pretty, the everything in between. And you don't omit anything because you think like, I'm never going to talk about this anyway, so I'm not going to write. No, you write it all down. It's like if you have a piece, like a big bag of Lego, you put on the floor, you need to pick up the pieces to know which pieces you have, so you know what you can build. Same thing. Once you've got those stories mapped out, you drive towards maybe 2 to 3 stories that you feel like, hey, I'm not quite sure why these stories might be relevant, but I think there's something in them. Like your story, for example, of when you first moved to Spain, right? That's like a great example. Um, and then once you've got that, you apply my 3C formula. The 3C formula is very simple, because one of the things I found when I was going through studying and researching storytelling for impact and enabling people to have a bigger impact with their message and their stories was that most storytelling formulas are great, but they tend to be quite long. Like 12
Mm.
steps formula of Joseph Campbell, you got 7 steps, or 5 why, whatever. So I wanted to come, because my brain, I've got ADD and I'm dyslexic, so I'm all over the place. So I need something really easy to basically filter through any story on the fly. I came up with this very simple 3-step methodology. It's called 3Cs, and it stands for context, connection, and conclusion. Okay. Context is, give us the minimum amount of information we need to understand where you are. So you might say, I don't know how old you are, but let's say I'm 19 and I've just arrived in Spain. I don't speak a single.
19 sounds
I,
right.
I don't.
Yeah,
I don't.
that's my
Okay,
age.
well, yeah, there you go. So like I don't speak a single word of Spanish, and yet I've got to find a flat, but nobody's picking up the phone because as soon as I say my name and where I'm from, they hang up. So you've just set up the context and the connection, right? And then you can go, but it turns out that when I changed my name and I actually said I was going through America, I would get these meetings, right? And you go through the story. And this is the third step that most people forget and do not do well. It's the conclusion. It's what's the point of your story? Now, meta here, one story can have multiple conclusions. You could use the same story and change it. For example, my story that I shared this a bit earlier about how I was traumatized at school because of my teachers. If I'm talking to a company around the need for us to share stories so we can create a sense of belonging, I can I can pivot a story towards that, saying like, if only someone had asked me like how I felt, what was I struggling with, or maybe even asked me what I was passionate about, I could have brought something different to the room and I had something to give to this experience, but I was never asked. Right. But if I talk about, for example, personal branding, I might say, hey, I know what it feels like not to have a voice. So you could use the same story and just have different conclusions. But in your particular case, when you shared your story, the conclusion could be that every single time we try and fit in, we abandon a part of ourselves that eventually we'll have to pay the check and pick up the bill. And sometimes, or you might have say, as much as I love to say being authentic self, sometimes the system in which we operate in just isn't ready. And you've got to kind of fit yourself in so you can get to the end goal. Like you could have multiple different conclusions to that same story. Does
Yeah.
that make sense? So you do those three things, you
Yes.
practice those, and then you share. Like I think where most people go wrong is that they think that their story needs to be perfect and clear before they share it. One of my principles of Storycast is your story sharpens as you share it. So the more you share your story, the sharper it gets. I learned that firsthand from the likes of Trevor Noah, a stand-up comedian I used to hang out in South Africa with, and I've seen him perform night over night. And I saw it, like his material would start taking shape. The same joke that wasn't working the night before would start landing because he would tweak it, he would change the word. And it's the same thing with our stories. Like I'm still fine-tuning mine. I'm still kind of picking bits of it, but it's just practice. And I know this sounds weird, but actually, I don't think I talk about this enough, and I should. But I would say self compassion. I would actually just have some self compassion, like whether you've done something that you regret, whether something's happened to you and you feel shame around. Like, just have some self compassion for the journey you've been on and that you're going through this process and that it's scary, that it's vulnerable, that you might get it wrong. Like, I talk about this in the book. I actually shared a very vulnerable story with someone who I thought could hold the space, and actually it was a disaster. Like it completely backfired, and I had vulnerability hangover, and I started to shut down. And then I realized, and I talk about this in the book, it's like, oh, we have different stories. We have stories that actually need a vessel that is very sacred, whether that's a therapy or a mental health professional or a deeply trusted intimate friend that can hold that. Not everyone deserves to hear all parts of our stories. You know what I mean? Like that there are certain stories that I
Mm.
think have to have some form of sacred respect to them, and others that you can learn how to take those wounds and turn them into scars and then give them as messages.
I feel like we could be talking for hours about this topic because it's so interesting, and you and I both are very, very passionate about storytelling. Um, Maybe to kind of like conclude this conversation with one thought is: it seems that our stories are dynamic. They're constantly moving. It's not that somehow people think that the story is somehow in the past. But the way I see it is that your story evolves with you, and your understanding of past experiences also changes throughout time as you develop, as you get more self-awareness, as you practice more of, all the techniques, and you do more coaching and more therapy or whatever it is, so that you understand, past experiences, so that you can incorporate them in your current story. So I feel like overall the story evolves
Yes.
with you
Mm-hmm.
through time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's organic. 100%. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
And with that being said, I just want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us about this and all the amazing stories that you shared today and the things that you are doing with your company with Storycast. I think it's quite interesting. It's amazing, and it has such a big, important purpose for the world because I think we need more stories. We need more magic. Maybe I'm still like as we said, we're anchored in the nostalgia of the past or whatever, but I think that stories are what moves people, and eventually, stories matter most.
I agree. Brave stories are needed. And if I could leave with one message, it's like every single one of us has a story worth sharing, even if you think you don't. And if anything, don't share it for yourself, share it for someone who needs to hear it, as to not feel alone, because you have no idea what meaning and purpose your story can have for someone else, even if you don't feel like it. So my invitation is dare to serve.